In the quiet, sun-drenched town of 𝐦𝐿𝐵𝐿, life seemed idyllic for Caroline Crouch. A young mother, bright and full of promise, her days were filled with laughter and love. But in May of 2021, that image was shattered by a chilling crime. Caroline was found dead in her own home, an apparent victim of a brutal robbery gone wrong. The nation was stunned, the story quickly becoming a media sensation. What began as a seemingly straightforward case soon unraveled into something far more complex. As investigators peeled back the layers, they discovered a web of lies, deceit, and shocking revelations. The tragedy of Caroline Crouch gripped the world, but behind the headlines, the truth was far more unsettling. This is the story of Caroline Crouch, her life, her death, and the investigation that captivated a nation. The morning of May 11th, 2021, started like any other in the sleepy suburb of 𝐦𝐿𝐵𝐿, Athens. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. But in one home, everything was about to change. At around 6 a.m., a call came in to the police station, a distress call from Babis Anagnostopoulos, Caroline Crouch's husband. His voice was shaky, filled with panic. He claimed that armed intruders had broken into their home during the night. He said they had tied him up, ransacked the house, and killed his wife before fleeing with their valuables. The officers rushed to the scene, their minds already forming a preliminary theory based on Babis' frantic words. It sounded like a robbery gone wrong. But what awaited them in that small, well-kept home in 𝐦𝐿𝐵𝐿 would soon cast doubt on the story they were being told. As they approached the house, the first thing they noticed was the eerie calmness that lingered in the air. The neighborhood, usually bustling with life in the early hours, felt unnaturally still. Upon entering the house, they found baby sitting in the living room, visibly distressed, his hands bound tightly behind his back with ropes. His face was flushed, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He looked like he had struggled to break free. His eyes darted around the room as he tried to recount what had happened, his words mixed with disbelief and terror. But it was the next room that held the true horror. Caroline Crouch, once a vibrant young woman full of promise, lay lifeless on the floor beside their bed. Her body was sprawled in a disturbing manner, evidence of a violent confrontation. There was no mistaking it. This was not a simple case of a robbery gone wrong. The brutality of her murder raised immediate red flags. The baby, Lydia, was found unharmed in her crib, still sound asleep. The sight of the innocent child, untouched by the violence that had unfolded in the very room she slept in, left the officers with a chilling sense of unease. How could the attackers have left the baby alone, without harming her? It didn't fit with the story Babis had told. As they surveyed the scene, the police noted the signs of a struggle. Furniture had been overturned, and several items had been scattered around the room, hinting at a violent encounter. But one thing stood out. Despite the chaos, there was no sign of forced entry. The front door was locked from the inside, and the windows remained intact. It was as if the intruders had been let in or had simply known the way. The officers began to document the scene, meticulously taking photographs and collecting evidence. Caroline's body showed signs of strangulation, with visible bruises around her neck. Her hands were still clutching onto the bed frame, suggesting she had fought fiercely for her life. The wounds were fresh. This had happened only hours earlier. Babis, still bound and shaky, was questioned further. He repeated his account, describing how the intruders had burst into the home during the night, threatening them with weapons. He claimed that he had been restrained and forced to watch as his wife was murdered. His story seemed consistent with what was visible at the scene at first, but the police knew something was amiss. It was too clean, too staged. They had to wonder, was this really a botched burglary, or was something more sinister at play? As the investigation progressed, the answers would begin to reveal themselves, but not in the way anyone expected. The discovery of Caroline's body and the strange circumstances surrounding the crime scene set the stage for an investigation that would go on to captivate the nation. The questions were many, the answers few. And at the center of it all was Babis Anagnostopoulos, the grieving husband who seemed to be the only one who knew what had truly happened. But as the police would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the police began their work at the scene, their minds initially leaned toward a straightforward theory: a violent home invasion gone tragically wrong. The brutality of Caroline's murder, coupled with the fact that Babis was tied up and helpless, pointed to the possibility of armed robbers targeting the family. The house, located in the serene and upscale neighborhood of 𝐸𝐿𝐵, seemed an unlikely target for such a crime. But in the early hours of the investigation, that was the theory they worked with, holding on to the belief that the crime had been random, the work of strangers. The officers quickly set to work, cataloging the crime scene with methodical precision. Forensics teams were called in to collect every shred of evidence. Caroline's body was examined in situ, with forensic experts noting the signs of a struggle, the violence that had been inflicted upon her, and the precise nature of her wounds. The rope used to tie up Babis was carefully collected, as were the traces of blood spattered across the room. Forensic analysis would later confirm that the blood at the scene was indeed Caroline's, and in another unsettling discovery, traces of a struggle were found all over the house: overturned furniture, broken glass, and a smashed lamp. Whoever had been involved in the confrontation with Caroline had been ruthless, but there were no immediate signs that the home had been ransacked for valuables, which would have been typical of a robbery. One of the most puzzling aspects was the lack of forced entry. The front door was locked from the inside, the windows were unbroken, and there were no signs of anyone entering or exiting the house through unconventional means. There were no broken locks, no signs of tampering with the door frame, nothing that would indicate that the family had been victims of an intrusion. For the police, this was a glaring anomaly. If this was a break-in, why had the burglars not forced their way inside? How had they gotten in, and why was everything left undisturbed except for the horrific scene in Caroline's bedroom? Next, the investigation turned to security footage. The neighborhood of 𝐸𝐿𝐵, being a relatively affluent area, had surveillance cameras mounted on various buildings and houses. The police sought out every available piece of footage that might provide a clue. It didn't take long for them to review the security footage from a camera positioned across the street from the 𝐸𝐿𝐵 Anagnostopoulos home. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to reveal that a car had been parked near the house late at night, just hours before Caroline was discovered dead. The car remained in the vicinity for nearly an hour, long enough for an intruder, or intruders, to enter the home, commit the crime, and leave. However, as the hours of footage were scrutinized, it became evident that the footage failed to provide a direct link between the car and the crime. The car's license plate was obscured, and the footage did not capture any clear images of individuals entering or exiting the house. It was another frustrating lead that seemed to trail off into nothingness. Still, the presence of the car in the area around the time of the murder remained a key piece of evidence, though its significance was unclear. The police also interviewed several neighbors in the area. Most of them had heard nothing unusual during the night, no loud noises, no signs of a struggle. But one neighbor, an older woman who lived a few houses down, claimed to have seen a man walking near the 𝐸𝐿𝐵 Anagnostopoulos home around 3 a.m., just a few hours before the 6 a.m. call to the police. She described him as tall with dark hair, but her recollection was vague, and there was no way to definitively identify him. The lack of clear eyewitness testimony added another layer of complexity to the case. Meanwhile, Babis remained the focal point of the investigation. His statement to the police was consistent, almost rehearsed. He recounted the events of the night, describing how he had been asleep when the intruders broke into the house. He claimed that they had been armed with guns and knives, that they had tied him up and threatened his life, and that they had killed his wife in front of him. He said he had been forced to watch helplessly as the attackers took their valuables and fled into the night. In his statement, he described Caroline's final moments, how she had struggled to defend herself and how she had cried out for help. But while Babis's words seemed plausible at first, the officers could not ignore the small inconsistencies that began to emerge. His story was remarkably clear, almost too clear for someone who had just experienced such a traumatic event. He spoke in a calm, composed manner, showing little visible emotion. It was this lack of emotional reaction that made the police uneasy. A grieving husband, they expected, would be shaken, perhaps even incoherent with grief. Yet Babis appeared almost detached from the tragedy that had unfolded in his own home. Still, in the early stages of the investigation, there was no hard evidence to suggest that Babis was involved in the crime. His initial statements were taken at face value, and the authorities focused their efforts on determining who the intruders might have been. Were they local criminals, or perhaps professionals who had specifically targeted the family? As the investigation progressed, the detectives began to dig deeper into Babis's background. They discovered that he had a history that warranted further scrutiny. Babis was a former pilot, and his professional life had taken him all over the world. He was a seemingly respectable man, married to a beautiful young woman, with a baby daughter whom he appeared to adore. But there were whispers, rumors of a strained marriage, of financial troubles, and of personal struggles that painted a more complex picture. The police began to question Babis more closely about his marriage to Caroline. How well did he really know his wife? What kind of relationship had they shared? Had there been any recent tensions or conflicts that might explain the tragic events of that night? His answers remained consistent, but the more they probed, the more the investigators began to sense that Babis wasn't telling them everything. At this early stage in the investigation, the police were still working to establish a clear timeline and uncover new evidence. Theories about a violent home invasion persisted, but the investigators knew that they were only beginning to scratch the surface of a case that would soon take unexpected and disturbing turns. The story of Caroline Crouch's death was not as simple as it first appeared, and as the investigation continued, the truth, however elusive, was slowly beginning to surface. As the investigation into the brutal murder of Caroline Crouch continued, the initial focus on a violent home invasion began to shift. Small inconsistencies in Babis Anagnostopoulos' story were starting to raise red flags for the investigators. What initially appeared to be a clear-cut case of robbery gone wrong was beginning to unravel. The more the authorities dug, the more they began to suspect that the grieving husband's version of events might not tell the whole truth. The police had begun their inquiry with a straightforward approach, focusing on Babis's account of what happened during the night. He had claimed that he had been bound by the intruders, who forced him to watch as they killed his wife and ransacked the house. But as detectives pieced together the timeline and examined the evidence more closely, several details in his story began to stand out as potentially fabricated. For one, there was the matter of the timing. Babis had claimed that the attack occurred in the dead of night, sometime after he and Caroline had gone to bed. But there was a crucial discrepancy in the timeline, one that would ultimately serve as the catalyst for the investigation's shift in direction. Forensic investigators were hard at work analyzing every piece of evidence found at the scene. Among the items they scrutinized was Caroline's smartwatch, which she had been wearing when she was killed. At first glance, the device seemed to be an insignificant piece of technology, but it would soon prove to be invaluable in unraveling the mystery. The smartwatch had recorded her heart rate, sleep patterns, and most importantly, the time of death. The data retrieved from the smartwatch was nothing short of a revelation. It revealed that Caroline's heart rate spiked dramatically just before her death, indicating a violent struggle. But what truly stood out was the time of death. According to the smartwatch's data, Caroline had been killed at approximately 4 a.m., 2 hours earlier than Babbis had originally stated. This discrepancy was more than just a technical detail. It was a glaring contradiction to Babbis's account of events. Babbis had said that he had been tied up and forced to watch as his wife was murdered at 6 a.m., but the smartwatch data placed her time of death well before that. If Caroline had been killed at 4 a.m., that meant that Babbis's story, about being bound and helpless for several hours before being discovered, didn't align with the evidence. The timing was simply too precise to ignore. This revelation was the first real crack in the seemingly well-rehearsed narrative that Babbis had provided. As the police examined the timeline further, they began to find additional inconsistencies in Babbis's actions that raised suspicions. It seemed that the more they looked, the more questions emerged about his behavior during and after the crime. The investigators were quick to focus on Babbis's whereabouts during the crucial hours of the early morning. After the supposed break-in at 4 a.m., Babbis claimed to have been bound and immobilized by the intruders. However, his phone records told a different story. Phone activity traced back to his device showed that he had made several calls and sent text messages in the hours immediately following Caroline's death. In fact, between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., there was a series of interactions that suggested Babbis was far from incapacitated. He had sent texts to several people, including friends and acquaintances, even though he had purportedly been bound and unable to move. One particular text stood out, a message he had sent to a friend at 5:30 a.m., claiming that he was doing fine and that there was no need to worry. This was highly unusual given the circumstances he had described to the police. If Babbis had truly been tied up and helpless in his own home, why would he have been so calm, so composed, and so able to communicate with others? The behavior seemed inconsistent with the distress that a person would naturally experience after witnessing the violent murder of their spouse. The text also raised another important question. If he was able to send messages and carry on as normal, why had he failed to alert the authorities earlier? Another key moment in the investigation that caught the police's attention was Babbis' initial 911 call. According to the records, Babbis had called the emergency services at around 6 a.m., claiming that intruders had killed his wife. But the dispatcher noted that Babbis sounded unusually calm during the call. He didn't seem hysterical, nor did he appear to be in any immediate danger. In fact, his tone was almost matter-of-fact, which contrasted sharply with the frantic nature of someone who had just witnessed the brutal murder of a loved one. This chilling lack of emotion during a crisis was deeply troubling to the investigators. Further complicating Babbis' story was the fact that the authorities had found no sign of any valuables missing from the house. The idea of a robbery gone wrong seemed increasingly far-fetched. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been taken. If the attackers had been motivated by robbery, they had certainly not followed through. The evidence suggested that the crime was far more personal, and that the motive was rooted in something far deeper than a random burglary. At this point, the police had begun to seriously question Babbis Anagnostopoulos' involvement in his wife's death. His behavior, the inconsistencies in his timeline, and the damning forensic evidence from Caroline's smartwatch were starting to paint a troubling picture. The investigation was no longer focused on external suspects. It had become clear that the person who had the most to gain from Caroline's death, the person who was most familiar with the layout of the house, and the person who had the most access to the crime scene, was Babbis himself. The breakthrough in the case didn't come immediately. It wasn't a single piece of evidence that made everything clear. Rather, it was the accumulation of these discrepancies, each building upon the last, that finally led the investigators to reevaluate their initial conclusions. Theories about a random robbery began to fade, replaced by a more unsettling possibility, that the crime was far closer to home than anyone had imagined. As the days went by, The police honed in on 𝐬𝐫𝐽 as their primary suspect, and the investigation took a dramatic turn. What had seemed like a tragic, senseless murder now appeared to be the result of something more calculated, more intentional. With each new revelation, the case grew darker, and the truth seemed more elusive than ever. The stage was set for a revelation that would stun the public and forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The turning point in the investigation arrived on a cold, tense afternoon as the police gathered all their evidence and prepared to confront 𝐬𝐵𝐽 Anagnostopoulos with the truth. By now, the investigators had amassed a growing mountain of contradictions in his story, the discrepancies in his timeline, the forensic data from Caroline's smartwatch, the phone records, and the calm demeanor he exhibited in the aftermath of his wife's murder painted a damning picture. But there was something else that loomed larger in the room, a sense that 𝐬𝐵𝐽 was about to face an unavoidable reckoning. 𝐬𝐵𝐽 had already been questioned multiple times, but this time the atmosphere was different. The detectives knew they had him cornered. They had built their case step by step, and now it was time for him to confront the evidence directly. Sitting in a small interrogation room, 𝐬𝐵𝐽 appeared noticeably more tense than before. His once calm and composed demeanor had started to crack under the weight of the investigation. The officers entered, their faces grim but composed, and the lead detective, an experienced investigator who had seen countless cases, sat across from him, looking him in the eye. "Mr. Anagnostopoulos," the detective began, his voice steady and unyielding, "we've been reviewing the evidence. Your statements don't match the facts we've uncovered. The timeline you've given us doesn't add up. Your phone records show you were communicating with others even though you claim to be bound. And most importantly, the data from your wife's smartwatch shows that she was killed much earlier than you said." 𝐬𝐵𝐽 shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced briefly at the detective, his jaw tight. His eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, but he quickly masked it with a forced calmness. He had grown accustomed to being in control of the situation, but this was different. The walls were closing in. The detective continued, presenting more evidence: Caroline's smartwatch data, the inconsistencies in his 911 call, the lack of any valuables missing from the house, and the absence of forced entry. Each new piece of evidence seemed to tighten the noose around 𝐬𝐵𝐽's neck, but he still didn't crack. He continued to deny any wrongdoing, sticking to the narrative that the attack had been a violent, random burglary. His voice faltered slightly as the detectives pressed him harder, but still, he insisted he had been a helpless victim, bound by the intruders. Then it was time for the breakthrough. The lead detective, knowing that 𝐬𝐵𝐽 had been withholding the truth, took a different approach. He leaned in closer, his tone changing to one of quiet determination. "𝐬𝐵𝐽, you don't have to keep lying. We know what happened. We know you're the one who killed her. The evidence doesn't lie, and we have all the time in the world to show you exactly how we got to this point. But it's your choice. You can keep trying to cover it up, or you can be honest with us." 𝐬𝐵𝐽 looked down, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. He remained silent for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. The detective's words seemed to reverberate in the stillness of the room, echoing in his mind as the full weight of his actions came crashing down on him. And then, it happened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, 𝐬𝐵𝐽 broke. His shoulders sagged and his head dropped forward. The veneer of calm finally shattered. In that moment, the hardened, composed husband, the man who had once presented himself as the victim of a tragic crime, seemed to deflate entirely. The facade of innocence he had clung to evaporated in an instant.
"I did it,"
he whispered, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. It was a confession, but one that came only after a prolonged battle between his conscience and the truth. The detectives exchanged glances, their expressions betraying a mix of relief and disbelief. They had been expecting this moment for days, but hearing Babis's confession was still unsettling, even for the most seasoned of investigators.
I planned it all.
Babis continued, his voice cracking as he finally looked up, meeting the detective's gaze.
I staged the whole thing. I wanted her dead. I couldn't handle the pressure anymore.
Babis explained that his marriage to Caroline had been far from the perfect picture book relationship that he had led the world to believe. Beneath the surface of their seemingly happy life, there had been deep, unresolved issues. Financial problems, infidelity, and growing resentment had eroded the foundation of their marriage. Babis admitted to having affairs, to having been in a downward spiral both personally and financially. He felt trapped in a life that he no longer wanted, a life that Caroline had seemed to dominate with her success and her bright, outgoing personality. The jealousy and bitterness had built up over time until it reached a breaking point. In his confession, Babis revealed that he had meticulously planned the murder. He had staged the crime to look like a violent burglary gone wrong, hoping to throw off the police and secure a way to claim insurance money from his wife's death. He had been trying to avoid financial ruin, and in his warped mind, her death was the only way out. He even went so far as to tie himself up, creating the illusion that he was a victim, helpless and powerless. As he spoke, Babis described how he had waited until the early morning hours to execute his plan. He knew that Caroline's smartwatch would record her heart rate and movement, but he had underestimated the amount of evidence it would provide. When the time came, he attacked her. It had been a brutal, violent act, but Babis was calm as he spoke about it, describing how he had suffocated her with a pillow, ensuring that she wouldn't scream out. The murder itself, he admitted, had been cold and calculated, a decision he had made in the heat of his despair, an action he would soon regret, but only after it was too late. Babis admitted that he had staged the scene to look like a home invasion. He had hoped that by scattering some valuables around the house and creating the illusion of a struggle, the police would be led to believe that the attack was random. The thought of taking her life had been deliberate, but the aftermath, his attempt to manipulate the situation, had been a desperate act of self-preservation. He wanted to come out of it with the least possible consequences, even if it meant losing everything.
I thought I could get away with it.
He whispered.
I thought I could make it look like someone else did it. But it's all falling apart now.
As Babis recounted the details of his crime, the detectives remained silent, absorbing every word. The weight of his confession was crushing, not only because of the brutal murder itself, but because it had been committed by a man who had once been seen as the grieving husband, the victim of a horrific crime. With his confession, Babis not only sealed his fate, but also shattered the public's image of him. The man who had appeared on TV screens, pleading for help and showing what seemed to be genuine grief, was now revealed to be a cold-blooded murderer, a man who had been hiding his true nature behind a veil of lies. The interrogation was far from over, but Babis had already begun to reveal the depth of his guilt. As the details continued to emerge, the case took on a darker tone, one that would rock the public to its core. The truth, once elusive, had finally been brought to light, though it was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The confession of Babis Anagnostopoulos sent shockwaves through Greece. What had initially been a tragic story of a young woman murdered in her own home quickly transformed into a national scandal. The facade of a perfect marriage, the public sympathy for the devastated husband, and the hauntingly familiar image of a young mother's tragic death all crumbled in the face of the truth. As the details of the case were revealed to the public, reactions were swift and intense. The outrage was palpable, and the public's sense of betrayal was raw. People who had once supported Babis, who had shared in his grief and empathized with his loss, now found themselves horrified by the stark reality of the crime. Many were left reeling, struggling to reconcile the image of the grieving husband that had dominated the media with the revelation of his brutal, calculated actions. Caroline's family and friends were left devastated, not just by her untimely death, but by the realization that it was at the hands of someone they had trusted, someone who had been part of their lives for years. Caroline's parents, who had initially expressed their sorrow and support for 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 during the investigation, now found themselves torn between grief and anger. For them, the betrayal was compounded by the fact that 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 had not only taken their daughter's life, but had done so with cold, methodical intent. Her friends, too, were left grappling with disbelief. Caroline had been described by those who knew her as vibrant, ambitious, and loving. She had been a mother who adored her young daughter, a woman who had her whole life ahead of her. The idea that someone who had shared in her life, the man she had married, the father of her child, could be capable of such cruelty was beyond comprehension. Many of her friends took to social media to express their shock, their anger, and their sorrow. There was an overwhelming sense of collective grief, a shared feeling of betrayal that seemed to transcend personal relationships. As the full extent of the crime became clear, the public's reaction shifted from sorrow to fury. 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵, once a sympathetic figure, was now viewed as a manipulator, someone who had orchestrated the perfect crime while pretending to be the innocent victim. The anger was palpable, with many people calling for the harshest possible punishment. The media coverage, which had once focused on the tragic loss of Caroline, now shifted to the question of justice and what punishment 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 would face for his actions. The legal proceedings began almost immediately after 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵's confession. Arrested and charged with first-degree murder, 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 was taken into custody, where he faced a barrage of questions, legal documents, and public scrutiny. His once polished image as the grieving husband quickly evaporated, and the public perception of him turned from sorrowful pity to outright condemnation. His trial, which would be closely watched, became a national spectacle. As the legal system moved forward, it was clear that the stakes were high, both for 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 and for the justice system as a whole. The charges against him were serious: premeditated murder, the unlawful confinement of his wife, and the staging of a crime scene. Prosecutors emphasized the cold, calculated nature of his actions, the fact that he had planned every detail of the crime, from the murder itself to the fabricated story of a home invasion. The evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. The smartwatch data that contradicted his timeline, the lack of any forced entry, and the fact that he had taken the time to tie himself up, all of which painted a clear picture of his guilt. In response to his arrest, 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 maintained a cold, emotionless demeanor. He had confessed, but there was little sign of genuine remorse. His legal team tried to present mitigating factors, arguing that he had acted out of desperation and stress, overwhelmed by personal and financial issues. However, this defense did little to sway public opinion. Many felt that his actions were far from the product of mere stress. They were the result of a premeditated decision to take his wife's life and deceive the entire country. In the months that followed, 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵's trial became a focal point for discussions about justice, family, and the darker sides of relationships. Throughout the legal process, Caroline's family and friends stood firm in their pursuit of justice. They attended every court session, their presence a testament to their unrelenting quest to see 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 held accountable for what he had done. For them, it wasn't just about seeking justice for Caroline. It was about sending a message to the public that domestic violence and abuse could not be ignored, no matter how hidden beneath the surface they might seem. The broader implications of the case went far beyond the specifics of 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 Anagnostopoulos' actions. In the wake of the murder and the trial, Greece was forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths about domestic violence and the ways in which abusive behavior can be concealed behind a facade of normalcy. The case shone a spotlight on the disturbing reality that domestic abuse can exist within seemingly perfect relationships, hidden behind closed doors, and often overlooked by outsiders. It raised questions about how society defines and detects abuse, especially when the perpetrators are able to manipulate their image and gain the sympathy of the public. In the months following Caroline's death, there was a significant uptick in public discussions surrounding domestic violence awareness in Greece. Women's rights groups and advocates for domestic abuse victims seized on the case as an example of how important it was to identify the signs of abuse before it escalated into something far worse. The case highlighted the need for better education on warning signs of abuse, the need for support systems for women in unhealthy relationships, and the importance of a legal system that could respond swiftly to reports of domestic violence. For Caroline's family, the fight did not end with Babis's confession or his eventual conviction. They became outspoken advocates for domestic violence awareness, using their pain and loss to help others who might be in similar situations. Caroline's mother, in particular, used her voice to call for better support systems for women in dangerous relationships, arguing that more resources should be dedicated to preventing domestic abuse before it escalates into murder. The case also had a significant impact on public perceptions of the role of men in relationships. Many people were shocked by the degree to which Babis had manipulated his image as the victim of a crime, playing the role of the grieving husband while hiding the truth about the violence he had perpetrated. This prompted a broader conversation about the societal pressures placed on men to appear strong, stoic, and unfeeling, and how these expectations might contribute to emotional repression and, in some cases, violent behavior. In the end, the trial of Babis Anagnostopoulos would not just be remembered for the chilling details of his crime, but for the way in which it forced Greek society to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, manipulation, and the ability of abusers to hide in plain sight. It was a case that left an indelible mark on the country, a stark reminder of the need for vigilance, compassion, and a renewed commitment to addressing the hidden epidemic of abuse that continues to affect so many lives. Caroline's tragic death, in many ways, became the catalyst for change, sparking conversations that had long been needed. And while nothing could ever bring her back, her story and the aftermath of the case would serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of looking beyond appearances and speaking out against the hidden dangers that so many women face behind closed doors. The tragedy of Caroline Crouch's death is a haunting reminder of the dark realities that can exist behind closed doors, hidden from view, even in the most seemingly perfect of relationships. Her life was cut short in a brutal and calculated act of violence by the person who was meant to protect and love her. As we reflect on the devastating loss, the grief of her family, and the unbearable impact it has had on her loved ones, particularly her young daughter, we are reminded of the irreversible damage caused by domestic violence. Caroline's daughter, who was barely a child at the time of her mother's murder, is now left with a lifetime of emotional scars. She will grow up without the love and guidance of the mother who adored her, and her future will undoubtedly be shaped by this tragic loss. It's a stark reality that no child should have to face, growing up without a parent because of an act that could have been prevented. The case of Caroline Crouch's murder has left an indelible mark on the community, one that cannot be erased. The betrayal felt by her family and friends reverberates throughout Greece, where the once great tragedy of a young woman's death has evolved into a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation, control, and the hidden nature of domestic abuse. Her story has sparked conversations about the importance of recognizing the subtle signs of domestic violence, about standing up and speaking out for those who may be suffering in silence. It has forced us to confront the uncomfortable truth that abuse can take many forms, and often it's the people closest to us who are capable of the most devastating harm. As the legal proceedings against Babis Anagnostopoulos have unfolded, the public has been forced to grapple with the aftermath of his actions, an unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. The case has also prompted broader discussions about the need for better support systems for women and children who are at risk of domestic violence, and the necessity for society to act before it's too late. Bobby's confession, though it provided some measure of closure, will never bring Caroline back. However, it has sparked a national reckoning, one that is beginning to shift attitudes toward domestic violence and abusive relationships in Greece and beyond. As we reflect on the resolution of this case, it's clear that while justice has been served in the legal sense, the emotional and psychological toll on Caroline's family is far from over. The ripple effect of this tragedy will continue for years to come. But in the face of this unimaginable loss, Caroline's family and friends have become advocates, determined to ensure that her death will not be in vain. Their unwavering commitment to raising awareness about domestic violence and pushing for meaningful change in the legal system has inspired many and will continue to do so in the years ahead. The case of Caroline Crouch is far from a closed chapter. It is a reminder that we must never turn a blind eye to the suffering of those around us, especially when it's hidden beneath the surface. We must all play a role in breaking the silence, supporting those who are vulnerable and standing up for what is right. Domestic violence is not just a private matter. It is a societal issue that requires our collective attention and action. As we conclude, we invite you to share your thoughts and theories on this heartbreaking case. What do you think motivated Bobbies to take such drastic and horrifying actions? How can society do more to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening? We want to hear from you. Share your insights, raise your voice, and help us keep the conversation going. Together, we can work toward a future where no one else has to suffer as Caroline did. Let's honor Caroline's memory by ensuring that her story leads to lasting change, both for her daughter and for all the victims of domestic violence who still need a voice.